Okay, this is the sample color correction. This is indicative of how this course is going to go. In this case, I'm not going to use the Pixel Wrench tool because this is just a sample for the Kickstarter, and most of you do not have the Pixel Wrench tool already or the Pocket Pixel. Some of you do, but when the course starts out, we'll refer to it more regularly. Okay, so this is the image that you may have already downloaded and given a try to color correct, and you can see here that we have some problems. The whole image looks a little green. Now we do have the cheat bars down here, which we're not going to use because it's cheating, right? But we will come back to it and see how we did. So the first thing we need to do is, and this is an important thing when you're color correcting, is go to your where is it again? Go to your eyedropper. I think there's something similar in Affinity, and change it. If you have a 5x5 average or a 3x3, change it to a point sample, because especially in pictures like this where the detail is relatively small, like in here, you don't need to be averaging over too many pixels or you won't get a good readout. So change that, and we're going to show our info. So this shows our CMYK readings, and it should already be in CMYK format. It is. And we're going to adjust the curves. Now, as you become a better color corrector, you might eventually use different workflows. Dan Margolis's workflow is excellent. He uses lab color and RGB. But this is a very simple workflow, and it'll get you most of the way there. So let's bring up the curves. Now, the first thing before we even make any corrections to the image, let's just look at it. Overall, it just looks green. Now, in CMYK, there's really no green. We have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So green is usually an indication of either too much cyan or too much yellow. Now, yellow is a relatively weak ink. So if in doubt and you see too much green, it's probably the cyan more than the yellow. Yellow will tend to brighten it up a little bit. So one of the first things we do before we look at skin tones is let's look at the neutrals. The neutrals in this case, as a rule, you don't know what's going to be neutral in an image. But as a rule, something that's been sitting out in the sun for a long time likely tends to fade. And when things tend to fade, they tend to reflect a little more uniformly across the spectrum, and that tends to create more neutrality. If you've noticed that bright colors when left in the sun become sort of pastel, leave them in the sun long enough and they'll even bleach to white or a light gray. In this case, we have some asphalt on the ground here. Now, when they laid the asphalt, it may have had reddish tones or yellow tones, but I think it's been out here so many years that we can assume that this is relatively neutral. We shouldn't have any strong tones of yellow or strong tones of blue or strong tones of red or magenta in this. So when we look at this, I'm going to move it around a little bit. I'm going to put my cursor over here. So this would be more of a highlight, and this would be more of a mid-tone, and these are more shadows in here. So when I look at my info box, I'm looking at these over here in my info box. By the way, the first set of values, just look up at the info box. The first set of values is where it is now. The second set of values is where it is when you've changed it. So let's just look at this. It says we have 63% cyan, 33% magenta, 32% yellow. That's a reasonable problem because it looks like we have way too much cyan for the image, and that probably is part of the reason why it looks so blue. So we're most likely going to have to pull some of the cyan out of this image. Now let's look at some of the skin tones. A skin tone with a little boy like this shouldn't have a whole lot of cyan in it. A little bit to make it look realistic, but the skin tones are typically magenta and yellow. And when we look at him, we see that it is mostly magenta, say with a less yellow, but when you look at the shadows here, there is as much cyan as there is magenta and yellow, and that's indicative of a problem. So over here in the midtones, you're going to have to look carefully where I'm moving the cursor. It may not be too easy to see unless you blow up your screen. Over here in the midtones of his forehead, you'll see that we still have too much cyan. So working on the curves box here, by the way, you have 4 curves on the box. Actually, 5 curves. You have your composite CMYK curve. You have your cyan curve, magenta, yellow, and black. Okay, so usually we'll avoid working on the composite CMYK unless there's some major problem. But that's sort of a dangerous one to work with because it changes the balance of the individual inks in a non-linear way. Okay, so looking at the cyan here, based on what we got on this midtone, which it looks like there's way too much cyan in the midtone, the shadow looks like there's way too much, although shadows are usually a little less reliable. For instance, we have a dark midtone in this wheel here. It's harder to go by that. Blacks will hold color where lighter colors that have been in the sun may not hold color as well. Okay, and then now if you don't know where on the curve it is, you can click and you'll see a little round ball is produced on the curve. That shows you where that color is for that curve. So this would be about midtones in the cyan. This is about quarter tones to a highlight. So I'm going to drag down the shadow point of this cyan, not too much, about there. And let's see where it looks like it's still too high. And over in the midtones of the boy's face, it still looks like we're getting there. But it still looks like there's too much cyan because we have about, you can see toward the shadow, we have as much cyan as we do magenta and yellow. We're going to have to pull that back significantly. So I'm going to take this 3/4 tone. By the way, there's highlight, quarter tone, half tone, 3/4 tone, shadow. Okay, so I'm going to draw back that 3/4 tone a good amount. Now watch what happens when you change the shadow. I want you to look down here in the quarter tones. As I move this shadow, you'll notice if I move it down, the quarter tones come up a little bit because it's evening out this curve. It's making it a little less curvy, a little more linear. As I leave it locked in at the shadow, this curve becomes more pronounced and you'll get more of a cartoonish look. You can see by looking at the serpent here that the colors are almost getting a little bit too bright, perhaps a little bit too unrealistic. So by dropping down the shadow, I even out this curve a little bit. Now, I need to look at my neutrals. I need to make sure now they're not getting too red. But it looks like I still have a little more cyan, or about the same amount of cyan as magenta and yellow, which is usually a good sign. If in doubt, a neutral should have slightly more cyan than magenta and yellow. And now looking at the boys' 3/4 tones and half tones, we're now looking at probably closer to what it should be. And if you look at the skin tones, they now have taken on a little more natural appearance. So we can go back to this little girl back here. We see very little cyan in her skin tone, which is reasonable because she's farther away. If we look closer, we see that there's, on the quarter tone, there's very little cyan, which looks about right. We'll go to the half tones here. And that's been dropped down significantly. So there's about 10% cyan to about 30% magenta and about 25% yellow. That's reasonable. That boy's skin tone should look a little more rosy. You don't want him to look too yellow. If children with a darker colored skin tone may look a little different, or an olive color skin tone. There's different skin tones, and you'll learn that more as you get into the Pixel Wrench tool. But this is a reasonable balance here. So now what we've done here, if you look at the curves, we've taken out a good bit of color information by dropping down this cyan curve. We didn't do anything too dramatic. We didn't do one of these little guys where we have a 2-image curve, and those are obviously complicated. We just did something relatively simple, a relatively simple color adjustment, because it looks like this image was damaged on some level. I may have had the preferences set wrong in the camera. I may have been trying to get a certain color effect. It may have been overcast that day, or perhaps the camera sensor was fooled somewhat by all the green in the image, because there's a lot of green in the image. So I took out so much weight, I need to add some of it back with this black. Look here. See, it doesn't change the overall color balance. What it does is it adds and takes away weight. So if I take out all the black, you'll see the image looks very washed out. This is where it is when it's neutral. If I add a lot of black in, the colors become too pronounced, almost not really posterized, but too high contrast. So adding black and removing black tends to raise and lower the contrast. Some people call it, the reason that's often called K, CMYK, is because K is short for key. That's the key plate. The key plate is the one that holds the information about the image. Less so with a CMYK image, more when you have text and type. But even with a CMYK image, that black plate holds a lot of information. It holds it holds a lot of the details of where the edges are. Okay, so I'm going to add a little bit back in. If in doubt, add it in about the halftones. These are the halftones. You don't want to add too much. And if I go back and take a look at these neutrals, now the gauge is the info gauge is not terribly useful with black. It's more of a visual thing, and it's kind of a trial and error thing too. When you print it, if it looks a little too high contrast, then you may want to dial back. But you'll find that there's a lot of latitude with using black, and you know, if I'm a percent or too high up, it's not going to look too different. If I'm too high up, or even by say 3 or 4% on blue, you'll notice a difference. But in black, you have a little more latitude. So let's just look at the skin tone again. As we should, we don't have any black in his skin tones. Skin tone should be natural, and that means lots of magenta, lots of yellow, and a little bit of cyan. And in these neutrals, you'll see that the whole image doesn't have a lot of black. It's mostly in the shadows. Okay, so I'm going to approve this. Let's just go back and recap what we did. We brought down the shadow point of the cyan. We dropped down the 3/4 tone significantly because the image was pretty screwed up. We didn't touch the magenta plate. We didn't touch the yellow plate. We added some weight back in with black just because we took so much weight out of the cyan. And cyan is a dark color. So let's click OK, and let's see how close we came. Now we're going to look at the color bars. Now, I don't know, if you tried doing this color correction on your own, you might have tried 100 different ways of trying to get that green out of there. I don't know whether you're successful or not, but what I just did would be a relatively unobtrusive way. When you're color correcting, you want to adjust the image as little as possible to produce a believable result. Because the more you play with those curves, the more cartoonish you tend to make your images look. So, okay, let's look at our cheap bars. These should be the values, the one that are printed there. Well, first, the easy ones. Let's look at the magenta. Okay, I'm looking at these values up here. Tell you what, I'll bring this box right down here so we can get it. We don't have to keep looking up at the top of the screen. And let's even see if I can zoom in a little bit. Okay, so our magenta shouldn't have changed. And sure enough, we have 100 there, 75, 50, 25, and 0. Okay, so that's correct. Obviously, we didn't change too much. You notice there's a little bit of yellow there. That's just an artifact of the JPG processing. Because JPG is a lossy image processing format. It tends to add colors in very, very small amounts where there wasn't before. Okay, again, over here, we're very close, 99%. We didn't change the yellow, so this should be right. Okay, now let's do the easier plate. Over here in black, we add a little bit of black. All right, so our shadow's still at 100%. Hey, not bad. Look, it was supposed to be at 75. We're right on the matzo ball. Yep, and 50. So we came down perhaps, we could have added a little more black, but that's not bad, 47%. And 22%, again, we could have added a little more black in that case. But does that need to be at 25? So if you go back and look where we made the black adjustment, you might want to add just a little more black. But again, that's pretty close. Now let's look at the cyan. So this should be about 100%. We've dropped it down to about 90. And it looks like we may have taken out a little bit too much weight there. But you'll notice in the shadows, because most of our shadow imagery is carried in the black plate, there's a little bit of latitude here. The important ones are the 3/4 tones, half tones, and quarter tones. So let's look at our 3/4 tone. It's supposed to be about 75%. We came up with 76. That's very good. The half tone is supposed to be about 50%. We came up with 49. Again, excellent. Our quarter tones looks like they suffered a little bit. They were supposed to be about 25%, and they came out with 17. So that wasn't, perhaps, that was close. We maybe could have done a little more precisely. Let's take our lessons learned. Now you see that, to me, that still looks like I did a careful color correction on these and then added the color bars so we could refer back. Let's see, if I were to go back, I'm going to revert. Let's try it one more time. Okay, so I'm going to move my info box. Okay, so I'm going to do the easy one first. Here's our black screen. Remember we came up to about there, so this time we could add just a little bit more. And here's the cyan screen. We dropped it down just a little, maybe a little bit too much. Okay, and our cyan, our 3/4 tones look right on. So I think that's pretty reasonable. So it looked like we took out too much in the quarter tone. So if you'll notice, that has a lot to do with the endpoint. We could drag it back up here, but that would make a what's called a parametric curve. It's a little complicated. When you start doing parametric curves, you add a little bit of complexity to the colors, and I think oftentimes you want to avoid those unless you're really good. If you're a real professional, you can start doing those multiple pull curves. But in general, when you're a beginner, you want to try to keep them relatively simple. Okay, so if you see when we change the endpoint, look what that's doing to the quarter tone. When it's up, it drops it down too much. So it looks like I took a little bit too much weight out of the shadow. So I'm going to draw up our 3/4 tone just a little bit. So you're basically making a sacrifice between the half tone, the 3/4 tone, the shadow, and the quarter tone. So we may not, that may be the best we're going to do. So let's go back and see how we did. Notice we had just a slightly different correction that time. Okay, and so now it's 92. That's a little better than 90 it was before. That's 78. That's a little bit worse. Again, it's always a trade-off. 53, that's pretty good. And 25, that's closer than it was before. I'd say both color corrections, the one we did previously and this one, I think are pretty good. The skin tones look natural. They'll print better. You notice we don't have any specular highlights. We'll get into those in later lessons, but I would say this is a successful color correction. And if you try that on your image, the method that you used in the first try, if you were that close, good for you. If you had some difficulty, then you might try the method that I just showed you. And in the other lessons, we'll get into things like specular highlights and really finding the Zen of neutrals, really making nice skin tones. And skin tones aren't always easy because everybody has a slightly different skin tone. And that's even within a black skin tone might be a little more magenta, or a Caucasian skin tone is different. An Asian skin tone tends to have a different balance. So learning about the beautiful different shades of everybody's skin is a fun process when you're color correcting in CMYK. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this sample tutorial.